Education is one of humanity's oldest and most enduring pursuits. It is through education that knowledge, values, traditions, and skills are passed from one generation to another. While today we often think of education in terms of schools, teachers, and formal curricula, the story of education is far older and much broader. It is a journey that begins with oral traditions in early societies, evolves into structured systems in ancient civilizations, and eventually develops into the modern institutions we know today. The history of education is, in many ways, the history of human civilization itself. In the earliest societies, education was informal. Children learned from their parents, elders, and communities through storytelling, imitation, and participation in daily life. Hunters taught hunting, farmers taught farming, and spiritual leaders passed down religious rituals and myths. This oral tradition was the first form of education, ensuring survival and cultural continuity. Knowledge was practical and immediately useful, but it also carried the values and identities of each community. In these times, education was less about books or classrooms and more about living within a cultural environment. With the rise of ancient civilizations, education began to take more formal shapes. In Mesopotamia, often regarded as the cradle of civilization, scribal schools emerged around 2000 BCE, known as the Aduba or tablet house. These schools trained young boys in the art of writing cuneiform on clay tablets. Education here was primarily for scribes, priests, and administrators who managed the complex bureaucracy of city-states like Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon. The focus was on literacy, mathematics, and law, all essential for managing temples, trade, and governance. This marked one of the earliest examples of education, serving as a tool for social organization and state control in ancient Egypt. Education was similarly tied to religion, administration, and state power. The House of Life, schools trained scribes who recorded events, maintained accounts, and preserved sacred texts. Hieroglyphic writing required years of practice, and scribes were respected members of Egyptian society. Education also extended into medicine, astronomy, and architecture, as evidenced by the achievements of the Egyptians in building pyramids, temples, and medical practices. Like Mesopotamia, Egypt's education system primarily benefited the elite, showing that in the ancient world, education was often a privilege of the few rather than a right of all. Moving to ancient Greece, we see a shift in educational philosophy. The Greeks introduced the idea that education was not only about practical skills, but also about cultivating the mind and character. In Athens, education aimed to produce well-rounded citizens capable of participating in democracy. Boys studied grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, music, and physical training, preparing them to engage in civic life. Great philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle debated the purposes of education, laying foundations that continue to influence educational thought today. Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum represent some of the first institutions of higher learning, where philosophy, science, and politics were studied systematically. In contrast, Sparta emphasized military education, training boys in discipline, endurance, and warfare to maintain its warrior society. This contrast between Athens and Sparta highlights how education reflected the values and goals of each society. The Romans inherited much from the Greeks, but added their own practical focus. Roman education emphasized rhetoric, law, and civic duty, preparing elites to serve in government and administration. Wealthy Roman families often hired Greek tutors, reflecting the high regard for Hellenistic learning. Institutions like the Ludus primary school and Grammaticus secondary school offered structured education, while advanced studies focused on philosophy and law. Roman education spread throughout the empire, influencing Europe and shaping medieval education centuries later. Yet, as with Greece, education was largely for the privileged, while the majority learned trades and crafts through apprenticeships. In the Indian subcontinent, education had deep spiritual and philosophical roots. The Vedic tradition emphasized oral transmission of sacred texts, with students memorizing hymns, rituals, and philosophical discussions under the guidance of gurus. The Gurukul system provided holistic education, combining spiritual learning with practical skills and discipline. Later, great centers of learning like Nalanda and Takshashila flourished, attracting students from across Asia. These institutions taught subjects ranging from grammar and logic to medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. Indian education valued the integration of intellectual and moral development, stressing the pursuit of truth and harmony in ancient China. Education was profoundly shaped by Confucian philosophy. Confucius, 551 to 479 BCE, emphasized moral cultivation, respect for tradition, and the importance of learning for good governance. His teachings became the backbone of Chinese education for centuries. The imperial examination system, established during the Han Dynasty, allowed individuals to gain government positions based on merit rather than birth. Candidates studied Confucian classics, poetry, and philosophy in preparation for these exams. This system, though highly competitive, created one of the earliest examples of meritocracy and ensured that education was closely tied to state service. It also reinforced cultural continuity, as Confucian values shaped not only education, but also society as a whole across these civilizations. One can see both commonalities and differences in how education was conceived. Everywhere, education was connected to religion, governance, or civic life. It prepared individuals for roles in society, whether as scribes, priests, warriors, or citizens. At the same time, education often reflected social inequalities, with access limited to elites, men, or certain classes. Women, in most ancient societies, were largely excluded from formal education, though they often played crucial roles in transmitting knowledge within families and communities. By the end of the ancient period, education had become a recognized institution, with schools, teachers, and philosophies guiding its practice. The foundations laid in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, India, and China would influence the medieval world and beyond. The medieval period would see the rise of religious education, the preservation of classical knowledge, and the birth of universities, developments that would profoundly shape the course of learning.